So continuing straight on page 87 and going right to the end of the scene now, Macbeth, straight after the toast, notices the ghost again. And as I've mentioned before, he's still trying to control the forces of darkness. He uses 3 imperatives on this line: avaunt, quit, let. And as I mentioned before, these imperatives are futile. The ghost, the witches, and so on are just not going to do what Macbeth tells them. There's a bit of a semantic field of vision here. We've got sight, eyes, glare. And this is a motif. This idea of eyes and seeing runs throughout Macbeth. Just one example being in Act 2, Scene 2, when Macbeth sees the blood on his hands, and he says, "They pluck out mine eyes." There's this idea that Macbeth cannot unsee the horrible things that he sees. But in this case, the idea of seeing is also that of Banquo, because Macbeth says, "Thou hast no speculation in those eyes." In other words, you're just a ghost. He's already said you don't have any marrow in your bones, your blood isn't warm, and you're just a ghost. You can't see anything. But actually, this is just wishful thinking on Macbeth's part, because he doesn't want Banquo to see him. He doesn't want Banquo to still be in existence and know the awful thing that Macbeth has done. Lady Macbeth once again responds by trying to present to the lords the idea that it's not really a problem that Macbeth is behaving this way, that it's just a thing of custom, a strange habit. So she's still being a good hostess, and she's trying to present this public persona, which is different from how she is in private. Macbeth's response, "What man dare, I dare," is quite an interesting line because it's broken pentameter. So as you probably know, virtually all the lines in Macbeth are lines of iambic pentameter. That means that they have 10 syllables in them. However, this line has only 5 syllables. And it is significant when Shakespeare chooses to do this. He doesn't just do this at random. And here, one suggestion is that Macbeth will dare to carry on killing and trying to seize and secure power till the end. But as a result, his life will be cut short, just like the line is cut short. And again, I would stress that Shakespeare does do these things on purpose. He's a poet. He can choose to make all his lines run right to the end, but it is significant when his lines are short, and I'll show you another example later on. Notice here, he's said, all of these awful things could happen to me. And for example, a Russian bear, an armed rhinoceros, etc., etc. And if these awful things happen to me and I'm still trembling, then you can call me a baby girl. And then just a couple of lines later, the ghost of Banquo leaves again. And Macbeth says, "Why so? Being gone," as in the ghost's gone, "I'm a man again." So notice here that Macbeth's gender identity changes with the circumstance. And what's quite interesting is Banquo is a real man as far as Shakespeare is concerned, because Banquo is both brave and good. So it's only when Banquo goes, because Macbeth is a baby girl here, or challenging people to call him a baby girl. But once the ghost of Banquo leaves, Macbeth is a man again. And just notice I've got these words hence circled in green here. That's just linked up to these imperatives: avaunt, quit, let. And so in hence, these are more imperatives where he's telling the ghost to go away. And as I mentioned before, it's futile, it's pointless. The ghost, well, here he does say hence, horrible shadow, unreal mockery, hence. But notice, yes, the ghost leaves straight away after he said that, but he was saying it right up here, and the ghost has taken all of these lines before he leaves. So it's not really effective on the part of Macbeth. So Macbeth then starts to, after Lady Macbeth again, telling him off, telling him that he's displaced the mirth, in other words, the happiness. He's got rid of all the happiness from the party. Macbeth starts to contemplate what's actually happening. And he says to Lady Macbeth, "You make me strange," in other words, a stranger, "even to the disposition that I owe." And this disposition is Macbeth's normal courageous self. So he's blaming Lady Macbeth for his loss of courage. And here he says to her, "When now I think you can behold such sights and keep the natural ruby of your cheeks when mine is blanched with fear." Blanched means white, or made pale. So in other words, Macbeth doesn't understand why Lady Macbeth still looks completely normal when Macbeth is physically affected to the extent that he's gone white with terror at seeing this ghost. So he's doubting his wife's calm reaction. It's possible he's speaking to the lords here, but it's more likely that he's speaking to his wife. And so there's a bit of an implication. I've spoken before about that close relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, but a bit of an implication that a rift is beginning to come between them because he doesn't understand her reaction to the ghost. He doesn't realise. So there's more dramatic irony going on here. You can add that in as well if you like. He doesn't realise that she can't see the ghost like him. So after Ross says, "What sights, my lord?" Lady Macbeth finally decides that enough is enough. She's going to get rid of the lords altogether, end the party. And notice her language here, the repetition, "at once, good night," but go at once. She's absolutely taking charge again. It's interesting here that she says, "Stand not upon the order of your going." So in the court, the lords would have left in the order of rank. So the most senior, the highest ranking lords would have gone first, and they would have very, very rigidly stuck to the order, right down to the lowest level lord going last. So she's telling them, just get out quickly, ignore your rank. But that's quite fitting that she says this because Lady Macbeth and Macbeth ignored the most important rank when they killed King Duncan. And again, they did this and they upset the natural order of things. So Lady Macbeth carries on taking on the role of a king. It should be the king who dismisses the lord, but she's the one who says a kind good night to all, and the lords finally leave. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are now alone together. And Macbeth uses a tricolon when he says, "It will have blood," they say. Blood will have blood. In other words, the dead will get their revenge. But this tricolon, remember, use the Greek term tricolon, the technical term, rather than calling it list of three or rule of three. It's a little bit babyish to call it that. And we've got this echo of the witches here, this idea of vengeance, on power on the part of the forces of evil and the dead. When he says stones have been known to move and trees to speak, well, he's talking about the fact that the natural world has powers beyond those of humans. But again, there's an ironic foreshadowing here because he doesn't realise what's going to happen in Birnam Wood when the wood begins to move in that final battle. As predicted by the witches, just one scene away in Act 4, Scene 1. When Macbeth asks Lady Macbeth, "What is the night?" in other words, what time is it? Lady Macbeth says, "Almost at odds with morning." At odds with means that night is in a struggle with morning. So this is a metaphor. There's a fight between the day and night. And this is actually a bit of a metaphor for the fight between the forces of good and evil throughout the play. Macbeth then goes on to ask Lady Macbeth for a bit of political advice. He says, "How sayst thou that Macbeth denies his person at our great bidding?" In other words, what do you say to the fact that Macbeth refuses to come in person even though we've bid him, even though we've asked him to come? Now, at the time, both in the 11th century Scotland when the play was set and early 17th century England, when the play was written, it wouldn't have been unusual for a noble wife to be asked by her husband for political advice. It wasn't unusual for that advice to be given in private. But, as we know, Lady Macbeth is an unnatural sort of woman. And notice in this scene, she's spoken quite a bit in public, but now that she's in private with her husband, when she should be giving him the advice that he's asked for, she's actually quiet. And all she says is, "Did you send to him, sir?" And then Macbeth says his part. So as with so many other things with Lady Macbeth, there's a real reversal there. Note here, Macbeth says that he keeps a servant feed. In other words, he keeps a servant as a spy in the house of every single one of his noblemen. It just shows what a tyrant Macbeth is and how suspicious and mistrusting he is of people that he's just called his friends. There's a caesura in this line, so the strong break is signified by the full stop, and it signifies a change because Macbeth has just been talking about political issues, about Macduff not being there, about the servants being kept as spies, but he's moving now to metaphysical thoughts. Metaphysical means beyond the natural world. If you want to write magical thoughts instead of metaphysical, which is a more straightforward word, you can do that. Because now he's talking about going back to the weird sisters, in other words, the witches. So he says he wants to know by the worst means the worst. And that repetition, it's almost like he's convincing himself of his own bad decision to return for more diabolical predictions from the witches. And again, he says it's for his own good. Well, how ironic is that actually it turns out quite the opposite for Macbeth. Notice he says here, "I am in blood steeped in so far that I should wade no more. Returning were as tedious to go o'er." That means over. So in other words, he's killed so many people that to try to undo what he's done would be just as difficult as to go on killing people. So he might as well just go on killing people. But notice he doesn't use the word difficult. He uses the word tedious. This adjective is a synonym for boring. And it's quite an interesting and odd word for him to be using here. He just sees the whole thing as a bit of a bore. It's almost like he's already experiencing despair, depression, and it foreshadows that sense of absolute despair in the speech he makes in Act 5, Scene 5, which begins tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Lady Macbeth here, she seems to be giving him some really good advice. She says, "You lack the season of all nature's sleep." A reminder again that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are both so unnatural they can't even sleep. But notice here, Macbeth straight away says, "Come will to sleep." And just like the witches, Lady Macbeth very subtly puts words into Macbeth's mouth. These unnatural women controlling Macbeth. Now notice here, Macbeth's third last and second last line, "My strange and self-abuse is the initiate fear that wants hard use." We've got a rhyming couplet going on here, and rhyming couplets normally end a scene. Look at a few other scenes and see how many of them end in a rhyming couplet. It's just a signal to the audience that that's over, draw a line under it, we've got something new going on now. However, we've got an extra line here. 7 extra syllables. "We are but young indeed." And it's just another example. Again, Shakespeare's done this deliberately. Macbeth is trying to unnaturally extend life. These 7 syllables shouldn't naturally belong there. We should end on the rhyming couplet. But Macbeth breaks the meter, he breaks the rhythm and the pattern, just like he's trying to break the natural God-appointed order of the universe. Thanks very much. That's all.